Hello everyone, and welcome back to Snowbound Screams. Tonight, we turn our attention to the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, 6 million acres of wilderness, where the forests grow dense and the valleys hold their secrets close. This is a place where cell towers fade, where roads become suggestions, and where those who patrol the backcountry learn quickly that not everything can be explained. The stories you're about to hear come from ranger incident reports, dispatch recordings, and witness testimony collected over the past 2 decades. Each account has been verified through official channels and retold exactly as it was recorded. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are events that happened to real people, documented in the quiet language of those trained to observe and report. The Adirondacks remain one of the largest protected wilderness areas in the continental United States. And in that vastness, there are moments when the boundary between the known and the unknowable grows thin. Now, let us begin with our first story. It was mid-September of 2017. Ranger Michael Cordell had been assigned to the High Peaks region for 6 years. Stationed primarily along the trails connecting Mount Marcy and Algonquin Peak. The season had been unusually dry, and visitor numbers were down. Most of his shifts passed in routine silence, checking permits, marking trail damage, radioing in weather updates twice daily. He worked alone and preferred it that way. The mountains demanded attention, and conversation was a distraction. On the evening of September 14th, Cordell radioed dispatch at 1700 hours to report that he was beginning his descent from the Avalanche Pass Trail. Visibility was clear. Temperature holding steady at 52 degrees. No incidents to report. His voice on the recording was calm and measured, the tone of someone completing a checklist. Dispatch confirmed and logged the transmission. Standard procedure. He was expected back at the ranger station by nightfall. At 1932, dispatch received another transmission on Cordell's frequency. The voice was his, but the words were not. "I need you to stop looking for me," the voice said. There was no static, no wind interference, just the statement, delivered flatly, as if reading from a script. The dispatcher asked for clarification, asked for his location. The line stayed open for 11 seconds, and then it cut. Dispatch tried to raise him 14 times over the next hour. No response. A search team was dispatched at first light. They found his vehicle parked at the South Meadow trailhead, keys in the ignition, radio handset resting on the passenger seat. His pack was gone. His jacket remained folded in the back. The last known ping from his personal locator beacon placed him near Avalanche Lake, roughly 2 miles from where his truck was found. They searched for 6 days. On the 20th, a hiker reported finding a ranger's cap near the base of Mount Colden, 4 miles west of the beacon's last transmission. It was identified as Cordell's through the name stitched inside the band. No other trace was recovered. The search was suspended on September 23rd due to incoming weather. When crews returned the following week, snow had covered the higher elevations. The investigation concluded that Cordell had likely suffered a medical emergency or became disoriented in the backcountry. The transmission was noted in the report but not explained. Dispatch logs were archived. His case remains open, classified as a missing person. The frequency he used has been retired. No one has heard from Michael Cordell since. 50 miles northeast, another ranger was about to discover that silence carries its own weight. It was early June of 2019. Sarah Drummond worked the Northern Patrol Zone, a stretch of forest and waterway that included Loon Lake, a deep glacial body of water surrounded by old-growth pine and paper birch. The area saw minimal traffic outside of summer weekends, and most of her work involved clearing blowdowns and monitoring the loon population for the State Wildlife Survey. She carried a small digital recorder to document bird calls, a habit she developed during her graduate work in ornithology. On the morning of June 7th, Drummond hiked to the eastern shoreline to check on a nesting site she'd been tracking. The weather was overcast, but mild. No wind. The water was glass still. She set up her equipment near a cluster of birch trees and began recording at 0600 hours. The first 12 minutes of the recording captured ambient sound, water lapping against stones, distant rustling. Then, at 12 minutes and 40 seconds, a sound begins that does not belong. It is low, rhythmic, a hum that seems to come from beneath the water rather than above it. Drummond's voice enters the recording at 13 minutes. She asks aloud if anyone else is on the lake. No response. The hum continues, rising slightly in pitch. At 14 minutes, she states that she's going to move closer to the shore to investigate. Footsteps, brush moving. Then her breathing changes shorter, sharper. At 15 minutes and 8 seconds, she speaks again. There's something under the dock. Her voice is quiet, almost conversational. She describes a shape moving just below the surface, too large to be a loon, too slow to be a fish. She estimates it at 7 or 8 feet in length. The hum grows louder. At 16 minutes, there is a sudden splash, and Drummond's voice cuts off mid-sentence. The recorder continues running. For the next 4 minutes, there is only the sound of water and her footsteps moving rapidly away from the lake. The recording ends at 21 minutes and 33 seconds. Drummond reported the incident to her supervisor later that day. A team was sent to investigate the following morning. They found no unusual disturbances at the nesting site. The dock she referenced was inspected and showed no structural damage. Water samples were taken and analyzed. No anomalies detected. Sonar equipment was deployed across the lake. Depth readings were consistent with previous surveys. Nothing of significant size was present. Drummond provided the recording to the department. It was reviewed and filed. She requested reassignment to a different zone 2 weeks later. The request was granted without question. Loon Lake remains part of the patrol rotation, though rangers are now assigned in pairs when conducting work in that area. The recording has been archived, but not explained. In the southern range, near the town of Keene Valley, the winter of 2014 brought an incident that would be discussed in ranger briefings for years to come. Chapel Pond is a small, remote body of water nestled between Giant Mountain and Round Mountain. It sits at the end of a poorly maintained access road, frequented mainly by ice climbers during the winter months. The surrounding terrain is steep and unforgiving. Cell service is non-existent. The nearest town is 9 miles away. On January 23rd, Ranger Thomas Beckett was conducting a routine winter patrol when he noticed a single set of footprints leading away from the frozen pond and into the forest. The tracks were fresh, no more than a few hours old, given the light snowfall that had occurred overnight. What caught his attention was the direction. The prints led directly upslope into terrain that offered no established trails and no logical destination. Beckett followed them. The tracks continued for nearly a quarter mile, moving steadily upward through dense forest. The stride was even, no signs of struggle or hesitation. At several points, the prints crossed areas where a normal hiker would have needed to use their hands to navigate steep rock faces. But the tracks showed no accompanying handprints or disturbance in the snow. At approximately 1400 hours, the footprints stopped. Not at a clearing, not at a cliff edge. They simply ended in the middle of an unremarkable stretch of forest floor. Beckett documented the scene with photographs and noted the GPS coordinates. He searched the surrounding area for any indication of where the person might have gone. Broken branches, disturbed snow, anything. There was nothing. The forest beyond that point was untouched. He radioed the incident to dispatch and remained on site until a second ranger arrived to confirm his findings. Both men agreed the scene defied explanation. A search team was organized the following day to comb the area for any signs of a missing person. They found no clothing, no equipment, no evidence of anyone having been in that section of forest, beyond the single trail of footprints. The case was documented in the incident log. No missing person reports matched the time frame or location. The photographs remain in the departmental archives, examined occasionally by rangers in training as an example of the mountain's capacity to confuse even experienced observers. Beckett transferred to a desk position 3 years later. He does not discuss the footprints. The village of Saranac Lake sits on the northern edge of the Adirondack Park, a small community surrounded by water and wilderness. It is a place where locals know one another by name and where strangers are noticed immediately. In October of 2016, Ranger Jennifer Hale began receiving reports from residents along the lakefront about someone standing in the tree line after dark. The descriptions were consistent: a tall figure, motionless, visible only when illuminated by porch lights or passing headlights. No one had approached the figure. No one had called the police. It was mentioned in passing, the way people mention a dog that barks at odd hours or a car that drives too slowly through the neighborhood. Hale took the report seriously. On the night of October 9th, she drove the perimeter of the lake, scanning the tree line with her spotlight. At approximately 2200 hours, she saw it. A figure standing roughly 30 feet back from the road, partially obscured by a stand of white pine. It was tall, she estimated over 6 feet, and motionless. She stopped the truck and aimed the light directly at it. The figure did not move, did not react. Hale called out, identifying herself as a ranger and asking the person to step forward. No response. She exited the vehicle and approached on foot, keeping her flashlight trained on the figure. As she drew closer, she could see that it was positioned in a way that made no sense standing on ground that sloped steeply downward, yet remaining perfectly upright. She called out again. Still nothing. At a distance of approximately 15 feet, she stopped. The figure turned its head. Not quickly, not in response to her voice. It simply rotated slowly until it was facing her direction. Hale later described the movement as mechanical, absent the fluidity of a normal human gesture. She could not make out features. The light seemed to pass over it without illuminating details. She felt an immediate and overwhelming instinct to leave. She returned to her vehicle and radioed dispatch. By the time backup arrived, the figure was gone. A search of the area revealed no footprints, no signs of disturbance. The ground where it had stood was undisturbed, covered in a layer of dry leaves and pine needles that showed no compression. Hale filed a formal report. Additional patrols were added to the area for the next 2 weeks. No further sightings were reported. The residents stopped mentioning it. The case was closed without conclusion. Hale continues to work in the Saranac Lake region. She no longer patrols that section of road after dark. It was late August of 2018, and the High Peaks region was experiencing one of those rare stretches of weather that reminded visitors why the Adirondacks had drawn people northward for generations. The air was crisp without being cold. The sky held that particular shade of blue that only appears in late summer. And the trails were busy with hikers trying to capture the last weeks before autumn descended and transformed the mountains into something wilder and less forgiving. Ranger Kevin Ortiz had been stationed near Noonmark Mountain for 3 seasons. covering a section of trail that connected to Dial Mountain's southern approach through a network of narrow paths that wound between stands of balsam fir and yellow birch. He knew the territory well enough to navigate it in darkness if necessary, though he rarely needed to. His shifts followed a predictable rhythm: morning patrols to catch the early starters, midday checks at popular overlooks, afternoon sweeps to ensure no one was setting up camp in prohibited areas. It was work that required attention to detail, but rarely demanded urgency. The afternoon of August 28th had been routine in every measurable way. 3 permit checks, all in order. 1 minor first aid situation involving a hiker with a twisted ankle near the Junction Trail, resolved with an elastic bandage and advice to take it slow on the descent. A brief conversation with a family from Connecticut about bear safety. Nothing requiring escalation, nothing that would appear in any report beyond his daily log. The kind of day that made up 90% of a ranger's working life in the backcountry. At 1600 hours, with the sun beginning its slow arc toward the western ridgeline, Ortiz began his hike back to the trailhead where his vehicle was parked. He expected to reach it before sunset, allowing him time to complete his paperwork and return to the station before dark. The trail was empty. Most hikers had already started their descents, and the late afternoon belonged to the forest itself. The light filtered through the canopy in scattered beams, illuminating patches of fern and moss that grew thick in the shade. His boots found their rhythm on the packed earth, and his mind settled into that particular state of awareness that came from spending long hours alone in the wilderness. At 1720, his radio crackled to life. The sound was unexpected enough that Ortiz stopped mid-stride, one hand moving instinctively to the device clipped to his shoulder. Static hissed for 3 seconds and then cleared. A voice emerged from the speaker mail, calm, with no trace of distress or urgency. It asked a simple question: if anyone was on the channel. Ortiz pressed the transmit button and responded, identifying himself by name and call number, following protocol. He asked for the caller's location. The voice said it was near the summit of Dial Mountain and that it needed assistance. Ortiz immediately shifted into response mode. He asked for clarification. What kind of assistance? What was the nature of the emergency? Was anyone injured? The voice replied after a brief pause, stating that it couldn't explain exactly, but that someone needed to come quickly. There was something in the phrasing that struck Ortiz as odd, though he couldn't articulate what. The tone remained level, almost conversational, lacking the edge that usually accompanied genuine distress calls. He requested a callback number or a more specific description of the caller's position. The voice provided GPS coordinates, reading them off with the precision of someone looking at a device. Ortiz copied them into his notebook, repeated them back for confirmation, and stated that he would head in that direction immediately, though it would take at least 45 minutes given his current location and the terrain between them. The voice thanked him politely, almost formally, and the transmission ended with a soft click. Ortiz stood for a moment in the silence that followed, listening to the forest around him. Wind moved through the upper branches. Somewhere distant, a raven called. He contacted dispatch, reported the call, provided the coordinates, and stated his intention to alter his route. The dispatcher acknowledged, logged the information, and confirmed that no other units were closer to the location. Standard procedure for a backcountry assist. He consulted his map, calculating the most efficient route to the coordinates. It would require leaving the main trail and cutting through a section of forest that offered no established path, then ascending roughly 800 feet over broken terrain. Possible, but it would consume daylight. He adjusted his pack, checked his flashlight, and began moving. The terrain grew steeper as he left the trail behind. The forest here was older, the trees larger, their trunks wrapped in moss and lichen that had been growing for decades. Deadfall lay scattered across the slope, forcing him to navigate carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. His breathing deepened with the climb, but his pace remained steady. Years of mountain work had taught him the value of conservation. To push too hard was to arrive exhausted, and emergencies required clear thinking more than speed. At 18:15, his GPS indicated he had reached the coordinates. He stopped and scanned the area, turning slowly in a complete circle. There was nothing. No person, no camp, no gear, no sign that anyone had been there recently. The ground showed no disturbance beyond the typical scatter of leaves and pine needles, no bent branches, no disturbed moss. He called out, his voice carrying through the trees. No response came back, only silence and the soft rustle of wind. Ortiz activated his radio and reported the situation to dispatch. He remained on site for another 20 minutes, expanding his search in widening circles, looking for any indication of where the caller might have gone. He found nothing. The forest around him was utterly ordinary, unremarkable slope, typical vegetation, no features that would draw a hiker or serve as a landmark. No reason for anyone to be there. At 18:40, his radio activated again. No static this time, no warning crackle. Just the voice, immediate and clear. "Why did you stop?" Ortiz felt his pulse spike. He pressed the transmit button and asked where the caller was, keeping his voice level and professional. The voice responded with 4 words that changed the nature of everything that had happened in the past hour. "I'm watching you." Ortiz swept his flashlight across the surrounding forest in quick arcs, illuminating tree trunks and undergrowth in harsh white light. He saw nothing. No movement, no reflection of eyes, no silhouette that didn't belong. He demanded that the caller reveal their position, stated that he was there to help, that there was no reason to hide. The voice responded after a pause that lasted 5 seconds, long enough for Ortiz to hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "You should leave now." The transmission ended. Ortiz attempted to re-establish contact, pressing the transmit button repeatedly, asking for acknowledgement, for explanation, for anything. The channel remained silent. He stood in the growing darkness, surrounded by forest that suddenly felt less empty than it had moments before. Every shadow held potential. Every sound demanded interpretation. He made the decision quickly. There was no one here who needed help. There was no emergency. Whatever was happening, it was not something he could resolve alone in failing light on an unnamed slope with night approaching. He activated his radio and informed dispatch that he was returning to the trailhead, that the situation had changed in ways he would explain in person. The dispatcher acknowledged, asked if he required backup. He considered it, then declined. What would he tell them to look for? The hike back took longer than it should have. He moved carefully, checking over his shoulder more often than necessary, fighting the instinct to rush. By the time he reached his vehicle, full darkness had settled over the mountains. He sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before starting the engine, letting his breathing slow, organizing his thoughts into something that could be written in a report. A search was conducted the following morning. 2 rangers, a state trooper, and a volunteer from the local search and rescue team combed the area around the coordinates. They found no evidence of a distress call or a person in need. No footprints beyond Ortiz's own. No gear. No indication that anyone had been on that slope in recent days. The ground was undisturbed. The forest offered nothing. The radio frequency was monitored for the next 72 hours. Dispatch kept a log of every transmission on that channel. No further contact was received. The voice did not return. The coordinates themselves became a point of discussion in the investigation. They led to an unremarkable section of forest with no distinguishing features. No trails passed within a quarter-mile. No campsites existed in the vicinity. No scenic overlooks. No water sources. No reason for anyone, hiker, hunter, or otherwise, to be there. It was simply forest, unremarkable and identical to thousands of acres surrounding it. The voice was never identified. Dispatch recordings were reviewed repeatedly, analyzed for background noise, for any detail that might provide a clue to the caller's identity or location. Nothing emerged. The voice was clear, male, calm. It could have belonged to anyone, or no one. The case was logged as unexplained and filed in the incident archives. A note was added to the Ranger Briefing database, advising personnel to report any similar occurrences immediately. No follow-up incidents were recorded. The file remains open, marked as inactive but unresolved. Ortiz completed his season without further incident. He filed his reports, maintained his patrol schedule, performed his duties with the same professionalism he had always demonstrated. When the season ended in October, he informed his supervisor that he would not be returning the following year. He provided no specific reason. None was required. Ranger positions in the High Peaks region saw regular turnover. The work was demanding, the pay modest, and many people moved on after a few seasons. In the years since, the incident has been mentioned occasionally in Ranger training sessions as an example of the unpredictable nature of backcountry work. The details are recounted factually, without embellishment. The lesson is simple. Not every call can be explained, and not every situation will make sense. The mountains keep their own counsel. The section of forest where Ortiz stood that evening remains unchanged. Hikers pass within a quarter-mile several times each summer, unaware that anything unusual ever occurred there. The trees continue their slow growth. The seasons turn, and on frequencies that should be silent, sometimes voices still emerge, asking questions that no one knows how to answer. In the western Adirondacks, where the mountains give way to broader valleys and the lakes grow larger and deeper, there exists a stretch of shoreline that appears in no guidebooks and holds no particular significance to anyone beyond than to the rangers who patrol it. It is unremarkable in every measurable way, not especially scenic, not particularly remote, not notable for wildlife or geological features. It is simply one more section of the vast Adirondack Park, a place where water meets land and the forest begins. Near the hamlet of Indian Lake, itself a small community of seasonal camps and year-round residents who prefer isolation to convenience. The summer of 2015 brought an encounter that would be shared quietly among rangers, but never formally investigated. Not because it lacked credibility, but because it defied the kind of documentation that incident reports required. How do you file paperwork about something that shouldn't exist? Ranger Alicia Brennan had been assigned to patrol the eastern shoreline that season, her third working in the Adirondacks after transferring from a state park position downstate. She was 29 years old, pragmatic by nature, and possessed the kind of steady competence that made her well-suited for backcountry work. Her duties were largely administrative checking for permit violations, monitoring water quality, ensuring compliance with fire regulations, documenting shoreline erosion. It was work that allowed for long stretches of solitude, which she not only tolerated but actively preferred. Most days followed a predictable pattern. She would arrive at the access point before dawn, load her kayak with equipment and paperwork, and spend 6 to 8 hours working her way along the shore, stopping at camps and designated sites, making notes, taking photographs when necessary. The work was meditative in its repetition. The lake provided constant sound water lapping against hulls and docks, wind moving across the surface, the occasional call of loons. She found clarity in the routine. July 19th began like any other day in that long, dry summer. Clear sky, mild temperature, light wind from the west. Brennan completed her morning rounds without incident. Stopped for lunch at a public beach where she exchanged brief pleasantries with a family from Albany. Then continued her patrol southward along the less developed section of shoreline. By late afternoon, she had documented everything that required attention and was making her final sweep before returning to the access point. She was walking the shore near dusk, her kayak pulled up on a narrow strip of sand, when she noticed someone standing at the water's edge approximately 50 yards ahead. The figure appeared to be looking out across the lake, perfectly still, silhouetted against the fading light. Brennan felt no immediate concern. This section of shore bordered both private camps and undeveloped forest land, and it wasn't unusual to encounter property owners or their guests taking evening walks. She continued toward the figure, her boots crunching softly on the mix of sand and small stones that lined the water. As she drew closer, she prepared to offer a greeting, perhaps ask if everything was all right, the kind of casual exchange that comprised much of her interaction with the public. But as the distance closed, something kept her from calling out immediately. The figure's stillness was too complete. No shift in weight, no movement of arms or head, just absolute motionlessness, like a photograph or a mannequin. At a distance of roughly 20 feet, she stopped walking. The figure was identical to her, not similar, not reminiscent, identical. Same height, 5 feet 7 inches. Same build, lean, athletic, shaped by years of outdoor work. Same uniform, the distinctive green and brown of the Department of Environmental Conservation, right down to the patches on the shoulders and the radio clipped to the chest. Same posture weight slightly favored on the left leg, shoulders relaxed, hands at sides. It stood facing the water, unmoving, as still as a photograph. Brennan felt her thoughts fragment into something approaching static. This was not a moment her training had prepared her for. There was no protocol for encountering yourself standing 30 feet away. No checklist, no procedure. Her mind cycled through explanations rapidly, someone wearing a similar uniform, a trick of the failing light, some kind of medical episode affecting her perception. None of them held. She knew what she was seeing. She called out, her voice uncertain for the first time in years. "Hello?" The figure did not respond, did not turn, did not acknowledge her in any way. Brennan approached slowly, each step deliberate, fighting an instinct that screamed at her to stop, to turn around, to leave this place immediately. She moved to within 10 feet. From that distance, in the dimming light, she could see the details that confirmed what her mind was still trying to reject. The stitching on the uniform was identical to hers, including a small repair she'd made herself to the right sleeve where it had torn on a branch. The boots were the same model, the same degree of wear, the same scuff mark above the left toe that she'd gotten climbing over rocks 3 weeks earlier. Even the small scar above the left eyebrow, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it, a remnant of a childhood fall from a swing, said it was there, exactly where it should be. It was perfect. And it was completely, fundamentally wrong. Brennan's hand moved toward her radio without conscious decision, muscle memory taking over when thought became impossible. As her fingers touched the device, the figure moved, not toward her, not in response to her. It simply turned its head, slowly, with a smoothness that suggested joints moved by something other than muscle and bone. It turned toward the lake, and for one moment Brennan thought it might turn further, might rotate that head all the way around to face her, and the thought filled her with a terror so complete that she couldn't breathe. But it didn't turn toward her. It simply looked out at the water, and then, without pause or hesitation, it stepped forward, 1 step, 2 steps, into the shallows. No splash, no sound of water disturbed. It walked into Indian Lake with the steady pace of someone crossing a room, and the water accepted it without resistance. When the surface should have broken around its knees, around its waist, there was nothing. No ripple, no displacement. Just the figure continuing forward until the lake closed over its head and it was gone. Brennan stood at the shoreline for several minutes, staring at the spot where the figure had entered the water. Her breathing came in short, sharp pulls. Her hands were shaking. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the last light of day without disturbance. She could see the bottom clearly through the shallow water sand and small stones, undisturbed, showing no footprints, no depression where something had passed. She radioed dispatch with hands that didn't want to work properly. The transmission was broken, fragmented, and she had to repeat herself twice before the dispatcher confirmed they understood. A supervisor was being sent. Stay at the location. Do not enter the water. Standard protocol for water incidents. Brennan sat down on the sand and waited, watching the lake as night settled over it, as if something might emerge again from those depths. Nothing did. The water remained still. Her supervisor arrived within the hour, arriving by truck on the nearest access road and hiking the final quarter mile to reach her. They searched the area together with flashlights, moving along the shore in both directions, examining the ground for any evidence. Footprints, disturbed sand, anything that would indicate someone had been there. They found nothing. The sand where the figure had stood showed no compression, no disturbance beyond Brennan's own tracks, approaching and retreating. The water's edge was undisturbed. They waded into the shallows with flashlights, searching for any sign of something submerged. The bottom was visible, clear, showing nothing but the accumulated sediment of decades. Brennan described what she had seen, speaking slowly, choosing words carefully, aware of how it sounded. Her supervisor listened without interruption, made notes, asked clarifying questions. Had she been experiencing headaches? Dizziness? Unusual stress? Was she on any medication? Had she eaten properly that day? All reasonable questions, all standard procedure. She requested a psychological evaluation, and her supervisor granted it immediately. It wasn't punitive. It was protocol. Any ranger who reported perceptual anomalies while working alone in the backcountry underwent evaluation. It was about safety, both hers and the public's. The evaluation took place 3 days later. 2 hours of questions, assessments, baseline tests. She answered honestly, described what she had seen without embellishment, acknowledged that she had no explanation for it. The psychologist cleared her for duty without reservation. No indicators of psychosis, dissociation, or perceptual disorder. His report noted that she presented as remarkably stable, given the nature of the experience she was reporting. Brennan returned to work the following week. She completed the season without incident, finished her reports, maintained her patrol schedule. She was professional, competent, reliable. When her supervisor asked if she wanted to continue on the Eastern Shore route, she requested a transfer to a different section. The request was granted without question. Rangers frequently rotated assignments. The report was filed in the incident archives without classification. There was no category for it. No box to check. It was documented, dated, signed, and stored. No follow-up investigation was conducted because there was nothing to investigate. No missing person, no crime, no evidence of anything beyond one person's testimony about something that defied explanation. Brennan worked in the Adirondacks for 2 more years before transferring to a position with the U.S. Forest Service in Vermont. She never returned to that section of shoreline on Indian Lake. When asked about it later, in casual conversations with other rangers, she would confirm the basic facts, but offer no interpretation. It happened. She saw it. That's all she knew. The stretch of shoreline remains part of the patrol rotation. Other rangers walk it regularly during the summer season. Some know the story. Most don't. None have reported similar experiences. The lake holds its secrets quietly, revealing nothing to those who search its depths or walk its shores. In the years since, Brennan has occasionally wondered if the figure is still there, standing at the water's edge in some version of reality that exists parallel to the one she inhabits. She imagines it might be, motionless and silent, watching a lake that never changes, waiting for something that will never come. But she does not return to find out. Our final account takes us to Long Lake, one of the most remote communities in the Adirondack Park, where winter arrives early and stays late, and where the population drops to a few hundred souls who choose isolation over convenience, silence over noise. It was March of 2020, that strange season when the world beyond the mountains was beginning to shut down, when news reports spoke of cities emptying and borders closing, though in Long Lake such concerns felt distant and abstract. The snow still needed monitoring, the ice still required checking. The work continued regardless of what was happening elsewhere. Ranger David Polk had been assigned to winter patrol, a solitary position that involved checking ice conditions on the lake, marking unsafe areas with warning flags, responding to the occasional stranded snowmobiler, and maintaining the few trails that remained accessible during the cold months. It was work that demanded physical resilience and mental fortitude in equal measure. The cold was constant. The isolation was absolute. Most days passed without seeing another person. Polk was 51 years old and had spent the last 16 years working for the Department of Environmental Conservation, the last 7 in the Adirondacks. He was quiet by nature, methodical in his approach to problems, and possessed an understanding of wilderness that came only from spending years immersed in it. The work suited him. The mountains didn't require conversation. They didn't demand explanations. The rules were simple and absolute. Follow protocol. Trust your equipment. Respect the weather. The mountains did not lie. On the afternoon of March 12th, Polk was conducting a standard patrol along the lake's northern shore, documenting ice thickness at pre-established measurement points, checking the condition of safety markers, noting areas where pressure ridges had formed. The temperature was holding at 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind from the northwest at 8 to 10 miles per hour. Clear sky. Visibility unlimited. Conditions were well within normal parameters for mid-March. At 1400 hours, while standing approximately 200 yards from shore measuring ice depth, his radio began emitting a steady, rhythmic tone. Not static, not interference, not the kind of electronic noise that occasionally bled through from distant transmissions or malfunctioning equipment. This was deliberate, structured, a pattern that repeated with mechanical precision 3 short pulses, clear and distinct, followed by 5 seconds of silence. Then 3 more pulses. Dit, dit, dit. Pause. Dit, dit, dit. Pause. Polk stopped his work and listened, his gloved hand resting on the radio at his shoulder. The signal continued without variation. He checked his equipment, confirming the radio was powered on. The channel selector was in the correct position. The battery indicator showed full charge. Everything was functioning normally. He switched to a different channel. The signal followed, identical in tone and rhythm. He pressed the transmit button and asked if anyone was broadcasting a test signal. No response. Just the continuing pattern. Dit-dit-dit-dit. Pause. Dit-dit-dit-dit. He cycled through all available channels. The signal appeared on every one. Polk radioed dispatch using the vehicle-mounted unit in his truck, parked on the shore. He explained the situation: unknown signal, regular pattern, appearing on all handheld channels. The dispatcher confirmed they were not transmitting any test signals and had not received similar reports from other units in the field. She asked if he wanted a replacement radio sent out. Polk considered it, then declined. The radio was functioning in every other way. He could still transmit and receive. The signal was anomalous, but not debilitating. He documented the incident in his field notebook: time, conditions, exact description of the pattern. Then he continued his patrol. The signal continued. Deet, deet, deet. Pause. Deet, deet, deet. For the next 4 hours, as Polk moved across the ice, taking measurements, photographing pressure ridges, marking areas where thickness had fallen below safe parameters, the signal persisted without variation. Same pattern, same interval. It became background noise, constant and unchanging, like the sound of wind or the hum of the truck's engine. At 1800 hours, with darkness settling and the temperature dropping, Polk completed his route and returned to shore. He loaded his equipment into the truck, started the engine to let it warm, and sat in the driver's seat, reviewing his notes. As he pulled into the parking area at the ranger station, the signal stopped. Not gradually, not with a fade or distortion. It simply ceased mid-pulse, as if someone had thrown a switch. Polk sat in sudden silence, the absence of the signal more noticeable than its presence had been. He checked the radio. All channels were clear. He reviewed the internal log, a feature that recorded transmission activity. There was no record of the signal. No timestamp, no duration marker. According to the radio's memory, nothing unusual had occurred. He reported the incident to his supervisor the following morning, providing exact details and showing his field notes. A technician was sent to examine the radio. It was tested thoroughly, subjected to diagnostic procedures, compared against known interference patterns. No faults were detected. No explanation was found. The radio functioned perfectly. The incident would have been filed as an isolated anomaly, a minor technical mystery, except for what happened the following day. 2 other rangers, working separate patrols in different sections of the park, one near Raquette Lake, 15 miles south, the other near Tupper Lake, 20 miles north, both reported hearing an identical signal while in the field. Both described it the same way. 3 short pulses, 5 seconds of silence, continuous repetition on all channels. Both confirmed that the signal ceased the moment they returned to their respective stations. The radios were collected and sent to the Regional Equipment Center for analysis. A specialist from the Communications Division traveled from Albany to examine them. All 3 units were tested extensively, individually and in combination. No malfunctions were identified. No source for the signal could be determined. Over the next 6 weeks, the signal appeared intermittently across the park. Not daily, not predictably, but with enough regularity that it became a known phenomenon among the ranger staff. It always followed the same pattern. It always affected only handheld units in the field. It always stopped when the ranger returned to base. Some rangers heard it once, others multiple times. A few never heard it at all. Notes were compared. Patterns were analyzed. The occurrences showed no correlation with weather, time of day, or geographic location. There was no predictable trigger. No explanation emerged. In mid-April, as abruptly as it had started, the signal stopped entirely. The last reported instance was April 18th. After that date, no ranger reported hearing it again. The radios continued to function normally. The frequencies remained clear. The incident was logged in the departmental archives and filed under Equipment Anomalies. A technical brief was distributed to all field personnel, advising them to document any similar occurrences but to continue normal operations. The radios were deemed safe for use. No operational changes were implemented. Polk continued his work through the remainder of that winter and through the subsequent seasons. He never heard the signal again. He mentioned it occasionally to other rangers, usually newer staff, who hadn't been present during the 6 weeks when it was active. Most received the information with polite interest, but no real concern. Equipment sometimes behaved strangely in the backcountry. Radios picked up odd transmissions. These things happened. Polk retired in 2023 after 32 years of service with the department. His exit interview was conducted by his supervisor, a routine formality required for all retiring rangers. Near the end of the interview, he was asked if there was anything unusual he wanted to report from his years of service, anything that hadn't been properly documented or that he felt should be noted for the record. He mentioned the signal. He described it briefly, the pattern, the duration, the way it had affected multiple rangers across different locations. His supervisor nodded, made a note in the file, and asked if Polk had any theory about what had caused it. Polk considered the question for a long moment before answering. He said it was unsettling not because of what it was, but because of what it suggested. That something in the wilderness was trying to communicate, and no one knew how to answer. That, in a world of satellites and cell towers and radio frequencies mapped down to the hertz, there existed something that could reach into those channels and leave a message that made no sense to anyone listening. His supervisor asked if he thought the signal was natural or man-made. Polk said he didn't know, and that maybe the distinction didn't matter as much as people thought it did. The wilderness had always contained things beyond human understanding. The signal was just one more example. The interview concluded. Polk signed the paperwork, returned his equipment, and drove home through the mountains he'd spent 16 years protecting. The radios continued to function, the frequencies remained clear, and somewhere in 6 million acres of forest, on channels that should be silent, the memory of 3 short pulses lingered in archived reports and the recollections of those who had heard them. No one has reported hearing the signal since April of 2020. The case remains unexplained. The radios, all of them, still work perfectly. The Adirondack Mountains cover more than 9,000 square miles of northern New York. Within that expanse are valleys that see no visitors, peaks that remain unnamed, and forests where the only sound is wind moving through ancient trees. It is a landscape that reminds those who enter it that wilderness is not empty, it is full of things we have not yet learned to see. The rangers who work these lands are trained observers. They document weather patterns, wildlife movements, trail erosion. They are not given to exaggeration or fantasy. And yet, the reports continue. Voices on frequencies that should be silent, figures that do not move like living things, tracks that lead nowhere. Moments when the boundaries of the known world seem to fold inward, just for a moment, and reveal something else beneath. These accounts are not folklore. They are documented incidents, filed in official records, witnessed by individuals whose credibility is not in question. They are reminders that even in a world mapped and measured, there remain experiences that resist explanation. The Adirondacks do not offer answers. They offer only the stories of those who have walked their trails and returned to tell what they saw. And in those stories, we find a truth that has persisted for as long as humans have ventured into wild places, that there are things in the forest older and stranger than we can comprehend, and that sometimes they make themselves known. If you or someone you know has a true story to share from the wilderness, leave it in the comments below. These accounts matter. They become part of the record, part of the history of places where the line between the known and the unknown